was a large brick farmhouse. Behind the house, there were lush gardens, and behind that, there was a cool, shimmering pond. That was as far as anyone ever dared to go. For beyond the pond, there were dark woods, full of scary creatures like bats and spiders and snakes. But this was a bright and very unscary afternoon when the farmer boy walked out of his house to do his daily chores. First on the list was to gather some water for his family to drink. So he galloped across the gardens toward a deep stone well just at the edge of the woods. The toad peered over the edge of her rock to look at her reflection in the water. But it was so dark to see. She wondered, how will I ever know if I have a jewel in my eyes when I live in such darkness? Her two toad sisters hopped over from another rock and said, surely the jewel isn't in your eyes. You're far too small and very, very ugly. Hello there, Toad. Do you like jokes? The Toad wasn't sure she she had ever heard a joke, but as she hesitated, the goose pressed on anyway and asked, "What is a toad's favorite drink?" "Hot cocoa." But the toad had more important things to worry about, so she asked the goose if she saw a jewel in her eyes. He looked deeply into her eyes, but suddenly across the lake a snake appeared. It slithered slimely across the shore, and when it saw the toad and the geese, its mouth watered and it snapped its sharp teeth. The toad was still quivering, so the goose told her another joke. "What is a snake's favorite state?" "Mississippi." Just then, the sun dipped over the horizon and darkness began to fall. The toad suddenly realized that she had nowhere to sleep, but the goose had a plan. He said, "Every night I sleep in a nice, comfortable bed, a flower bed. Follow me." So the goose led the toad to the flower bed, which was nestled under the shade of a beautiful tree. As the toad and the goose snuggled up among the flowers, the fireflies awoke to do their shimmering dance, and the flowers that only bloomed at night opened in the light of the full moon. explored the world outside of her web. With this happy thought, she fell fast asleep. When she opened her eyes early the next morning, the toad looked up and saw a caterpillar hanging from a tree branch above the flower bed. The caterpillar was swaying lazily in the wind and was just beginning to poke out of its cocoon. They soared and dived weightlessly in the air as they flapped their graceful wings. Of course, toads don't have wings, but she already had left the dark, slimy well. Maybe she could find a way to climb even higher, to explore even more of this beautiful world. But her reverie was broken when the snake suddenly appeared. First, the snake chased after the geese, who flew away. Then he raced toward the toad, who hopped away. Finally, he slithered hungrily toward the caterpillar, who was still struggling in her cocoon. from up here?" The toad grinned widely and accepted. The stork swooped down and picked up the toad. As they rose higher and higher above the farm, she looked down and saw the well where she was born. She thought of her mother, and the toad suddenly realized that she did have a jewel in her eyes. That jewel was her ambition, to explore the world around her and to help her friends stay out of danger. The geese and the butterfly flew alongside the stork as the morning sun rose higher and higher. In that beautiful moment, the toad felt like she was one with the whole earth, with the air, and with the bright sun. She closed her eyes, and she smiled.